The morning sun peeked through the grimy windows of the Golden Cup diner, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. Min had been on her feet since 5 in the morning, her black non-slick shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped tiles. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air as she balanced 3 plates along her arm, a skill perfected over 2 years of double shifts. "Order up for table 7," she called out, her voice carrying the warmth that kept customers coming back. The regulars loved her, especially old Mr. Parker, who always sat in her section and ordered the same breakfast: 2 eggs over easy, wheat toast, and a coffee that never seemed to empty. The diner hummed with morning chatter. Business people in pressed suits tapped away on their phones while construction workers enjoyed their pre-work meals. Min knew all their usual orders by heart, like a musician knows their favorite pieces. She'd given each table a nickname in her head: the Window Wanderers, the Coffee Club, the Sunrise Squad. Between refilling coffee cups and jotting down orders, Min's mind often drifted to her tiny apartment 12 blocks away. There, next to the window overlooking a brick wall, sat her most precious possession, her grandmother's upright piano. The ancient instrument, with its slightly yellowed keys and gentle creaks, had been her confidant through countless sleepless nights. The lunch rush brought in waves of hungry office workers, their ties loosened and sleeves rolled up. Min moved like a dancer through the narrow spaces between tables, dodging fellow servers and balancing plates with practiced grace. Her long dark hair was neatly tied back, wisps escaping to frame her face as she worked. "Hey, sweetie, could I get some more coffee?" called out a regular from the counter. Min grabbed the coffee pot without breaking stride, pouring a perfect stream into the waiting cup. "You're an angel," the customer said, and Min replied with a genuine smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. What none of them knew was that those same hands that carried plates and wiped down tables had once coaxed beautiful melodies from grand pianos in concert halls. Those fingers that now punched orders into the ancient register had once danced across keys, bringing Beethoven and Mozart to life. As the day wore on, Min's feet ached in her practical black shoes, but her spirit remained light. She hummed quietly to herself as she worked, sometimes classical pieces, sometimes her own compositions. The kitchen staff had grown used to her melodic mumblings, even if they didn't recognize the complex classical pieces she absent-mindedly recreated. Back in her apartment, after her double shift ended, Min would slip off her shoes and pad across the worn carpet to her piano. The neighbors never complained about her late-night playing. The walls were thick, and besides, Mrs. Rodriguez from next door said it helped her grandbaby sleep. Tonight, like every night, her fingers found the keys in the dim light. She didn't need to see the sheet music anymore. These pieces lived in her heart. The gentle notes of a nocturne filled her small living room as she played, her work clothes still carrying the scent of coffee and French fries. This was her ritual, her secret symphony. In these quiet moments, she wasn't just a waitress who lived paycheck to paycheck. She was an artist, a musician, a dreamer who spoke through the language of music. But tomorrow morning, she would return to the Golden Cup, ready to serve up smiles and coffee with the same dedication she gave to her music. Little did she know that her 2 worlds, the reliable routine of the diner and the passionate pull of music, were about to collide in ways she never expected. For now, though, she lost herself in the melody, letting the music wash away the day's fatigue, one note at a time. The lunch rush at the Golden Cup was in full swing, with the clatter of plates and the hum of conversation filling every corner of the diner. Min moved swiftly between tables, her order pad already half full with scribbled requests. The ancient ceiling fans spun lazily overhead, barely stirring the warm afternoon air. That's when she heard it, the first familiar notes drifting from the diner's old jukebox. Someone had selected Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she knew as well as her own heartbeat. The melody floated above the dining room chatter, and without thinking, Min began to move differently. Her steps fell in perfect time with the music's gentle rhythm. As she carried plates to table 12, Her movements became fluid, almost dance-like. She didn't even realize she was humming along, adding her own subtle variations to the classical piece, her muscle memory taking over as her fingers twitched slightly at her sides. At table 6 sat a man with silver-streaked hair and wire-rimmed glasses, who had ordered nothing but black coffee and apple pie. His eyes followed Min's movements with growing interest. He noticed how she anticipated each phrase of music, how her body seemed to know exactly when the next note would fall. These weren't the movements of someone who simply enjoyed music. They were the instincts of a trained musician. The piece ended, fading into the usual diner soundtrack of clattering dishes and conversation. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Min felt it as she approached table 6 to refill the man's coffee cup. His kind eyes met hers with a knowing look that made her pause. "That was quite an interpretation of Chopin," he said softly, his voice carrying a hint of an accent she couldn't quite place. "Your harmonies were unexpected. Beautiful." Min's hand trembled slightly as she poured the coffee. Nobody here was supposed to notice. Nobody was supposed to see past her waitress uniform to the musician hiding underneath. "I don't know what you mean," she said, but her voice wavered just enough to give her away. "The way you moved, the way you hummed, those aren't things you can fake. You've studied, haven't you?" He introduced himself as Professor Lee, from the city's Conservatory of Music. Min found herself standing there longer than she should have, drawn into a conversation about different interpretations of Chopin's nocturnes. Over the next few weeks, Professor Lee became a regular at table 6. He would come during the quiet hours between lunch and dinner, ordering coffee and whatever pie was fresh that day. Their conversations grew longer, spanning from Bach to Brahms, from classical theory to modern compositions. One quiet afternoon, as Min wiped down nearby tables, he asked her the question she'd been dreading. "Why did you stop performing?" The words hung in the air between them. Min's cloth paused mid-swipe on the Formica tabletop. Through the window, she watched a yellow bus roll past, buying time before she answered. "Life happened," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My grandmother got sick. Someone had to take care of her. The piano became something private." Professor Lee nodded, understanding in his eyes. "But the music never left you," he observed. "It's still there in everything you do." He told her about a special program at the conservatory, one designed for non-traditional students. Classes in the evenings, flexible schedules, scholarship opportunities. Min listened, her heart racing with possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to consider in years. As she cleared his table that day, Professor Lee left something beside his coffee cup, a conservatory brochure and an application form. Min slipped them into her apron pocket, where they seemed to burn against her side for the rest of her shift. That night, at her grandmother's piano, her playing was different. The familiar notes of Chopin's nocturne filled her apartment, but this time they carried something new, the first flickering of hope, like a candle flame catching in the dark. The application form sat on Min's kitchen counter for 3 days, untouched except for the coffee ring stain in one corner. She glanced at it while making her morning tea, the blank spaces seeming to grow larger each time she looked. The brochure's glossy pages showed grand pianos and concert halls that felt like memories from someone else's life. During her shifts at the Golden Cup, she found herself watching the clock more often, counting the hours until she could return home to practice. The familiar diner sounds, the sizzle of the grill, the chime of the door, the clinking of coffee cups, had become an odd accompaniment to the classical pieces playing in her head. "You're different lately," observed Mrs. Wang, who'd owned the diner for 20 years. She caught Min humming Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata while restocking sugar packets. "Your mind's somewhere else, isn't it?" Min looked up, startled. Mrs. Wang's eyes were kind but knowing, reminding her of her grandmother. "I've been thinking about music again," Min admitted, her voice soft. "Really thinking about it, I mean." Mrs. Wang pulled up a stool at the counter, patting the seat next to her. It was that quiet hour between breakfast and lunch when the diner seemed to hold its breath. "Tell me," she said simply. The words tumbled out then. About Professor Lee's visits, the conservatory program, the dreams she'd packed away years ago, like winter clothes in spring. Mrs. Wang listened, nodding occasionally, her hands wrapped around a cooling cup of tea. "Your grandmother would be proud, you know," Mrs. Wang said when Min finished. "She didn't want you to give up music forever. She told me that once when she came in for soup during her treatments." Min's eyes widened. "You knew my grandmother?" Mrs. Wang smiled. "She came in sometimes when you were working doubles. She worried about you working so hard. But mostly, she worried that you'd forget how much you loved music." That evening, Professor Lee sat at his usual table, grading papers while nursing his coffee. Min approached with the coffee pot and her folded apron in her hands. "I have questions," she said, sitting down across from him for the first time. "About the program." They talked until the street lights came on outside, casting long shadows across the diner's checkered floor. Professor Lee explained everything. The evening classes, the practice rooms available 24 hours a day, the performance requirements. He didn't sugarcoat the challenges. It would be hard, juggling work and study. The other students would be younger, with fewer responsibilities. "But I've heard you humming while you work," he said, pushing his wire-rimmed glasses up his nose. "You have something many trained musicians lack. You live and breathe the music. It's part of your everyday movements, your natural rhythm." Min twisted her hands in her lap. "I haven't performed in public for 10 years, she whispered. "The last time was at my high school graduation. I haven't even played for anyone except my neighbors since my grandmother." She trailed off, but Professor Lee waited patiently. The diner's ancient ceiling fan whirred above them, marking time like a metronome. "I'm afraid," she finally admitted, "not of playing. Playing is like breathing. I'm afraid of wanting this again, of letting myself hope." Professor Lee set down his red grading pen. "Fear and hope often come as a pair," he said gently. "Like harmony and melody. One supports the other." That night, Min filled out the application form at her kitchen table. Her hand shook slightly as she wrote, but her letters were clear and determined. Outside her window, a street musician was playing saxophone, the blues notes floating up to her fifth-floor apartment. She found herself smiling at how the music seemed to underscore this moment, like a soundtrack to her own small act of courage. When she finally sat at her piano, her grandmother's favorite shawl still draped over the bench, the music that flowed from her fingers was different. It wasn't just practice anymore. It was preparation. It was possibility. It was the first step on a path she'd thought was closed forever, now opening before her like a familiar but forgotten song. The first rejection letter came on a Tuesday. Min found it in her mailbox, tucked between bills and takeout menus. 2 more conservatories had turned her down by Friday, all citing her long absence from formal music education. Each envelope felt heavier than the last, weighted with disappointment. At work, she dropped a stack of plates. The crash brought the entire diner to a standstill. As she knelt to clean up the mess, her hands trembling, Mrs. Wang appeared with a broom and a quiet understanding in her eyes. "Take 5 minutes," she said softly, helping Min to her feet. "The dishes can wait." In the break room, Min sat with her head in her hands. The walls were covered with years of staff photos, birthday celebrations, and holiday parties. Her own face smiled back at her from several of them, marking the seasons she'd spent in this place that had become her second home. "I was crazy to think I could do this," she whispered to herself, remembering the pile of rejection letters on her kitchen table. But even as the words left her mouth, her fingers were tapping out the rhythm of Bach's Prelude in C major on her knee, a habit she couldn't break if she tried. That evening, Professor Lee sat at his usual table, but Min couldn't meet his eyes as she poured his coffee. "I heard back from some schools," she said, her voice flat. "They said no." He looked up from his papers, adjusting his glasses. But not from our conservatory, he noted. Min shook her head. Their application was still pending, but after the other rejections, Holt felt dangerous. You know, Professor Lee said, stirring his coffee thoughtfully, I once had a student who came to us after 15 years as a mechanic. Everyone said he was too old, too rough around the edges. Today he plays first-chair violin with the city orchestra. Min paused in wiping down the neighboring table. What made the difference? He didn't let anyone else define his relationship with music, Professor Lee replied. Just like you haven't. Even when you stopped performing, you never stopped playing, did you? The truth of his words hit home. Through all the late shifts, through her grandmother's illness, through the years of putting everyone else first, she had always found her way back to the piano. Even if it was at 3 in the morning, even if her fingers were tired from carrying plates, even if she could barely keep her eyes open. That night, she stayed late at the diner, helping with inventory. As she counted boxes of napkins and coffee filters, Mrs. Wong shared stories about her own life. About coming to this country with nothing but determination, about building the diner from scratch, about all the times people told her she couldn't succeed. Sometimes, Mrs. Wong said, checking off items on her list, the biggest thing holding us back is the voice in our own head. The one that says we're too old, too late, too something. Min thought about her grandmother then. How she'd worked 2 jobs to pay for Min's childhood piano lessons. How she'd fallen asleep in the audience of every recital, but never missed a single one. How, even in her final days, she would ask Min to play, saying the music helped with the pain. Back home, Min sat at her piano. Instead of practicing her usual pieces, she began to play something new. A melody that had been forming in her head during her shifts, built from the rhythms of diner life. The clinking of cups became high, bright notes. The steady chopping from the kitchen became a rhythmic bass line. The swing of the door, the scrape of chairs, the murmur of conversations. All of it transformed into music under her fingers. She played until the sky began to lighten, until her arms ached, until the melody was perfect. Then she reached for her phone and, with hands that barely shook at all, recorded herself playing. The conservatory application had asked for a video submission. Maybe, she thought, they needed to hear something different. Something that showed them who she really was, not who she used to be. As the sun rose over the city, Min finally slept, her dreams full of music that sounded like hope, like courage, like the beginning of something new. The delivery truck wasn't supposed to come on Wednesdays. That's why Min was confused when she heard the back door buzzer during the afternoon lull. She wiped her hands on her apron and headed to the loading dock, expecting another mix-up with the produce order. Instead, she found 2 men carefully maneuvering a large object wrapped in moving blankets through the door. Mrs. Wong stood supervising, her face trying and failing to hide a smile. It goes in the storage room, she directed, pretending not to notice Min's bewildered expression. When they pulled away the blankets, Min's heart stopped. There, gleaming under the fluorescent lights, stood a digital piano. Not a toy keyboard or a cheap imitation, but a professional-grade instrument with weighted keys and a proper stand. Mrs. Wong, Min's voice caught in her throat. Her boss just waved away her words. The storage room's been empty since we stopped stocking those awful frozen pies nobody liked, Mrs. Wong said matter-of-factly. Besides, everyone knows you play better after you've practiced. The news spread through the diner like wildfire. Regular customers poked their heads into the storage room throughout the day, admiring the unexpected addition. Old Mr. Chen, who'd been coming in for breakfast every morning for 12 years, asked if she would play something. Anything, for them. Min hesitated. Her fingers itched to touch the keys, but her stomach churned at the thought of playing in public. The last time she performed for anyone besides her neighbors was that graduation ceremony 10 years ago, when she'd frozen halfway through Beethoven's Pathetique Sonata. Just one song. Mr. Chen persisted gently. Like you're at home. The storage room slowly filled with people. Regulars who'd known her for years, the kitchen staff on their breaks, even the delivery guys who'd brought the piano. Min sat on the bench, her work shoes feeling strange on the pedals. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and began to play. She chose Debussy's Clair de Lune, not because it was flashy or impressive, but because it was the piece she played when she needed to remind herself why she loved music. The familiar notes filled the small room, transforming the storage space into something magical. As she played, she forgot about her audience. Forgot about the boxes of napkins and cleaning supplies lining the walls. Forgot about her fears. The music flowed through her like a river finding its path, natural and unstoppable. When the final notes faded, there was a moment of perfect silence. Then the room erupted in applause. Min opened her eyes to find Mrs. Wang wiping tears from her cheeks. The kitchen staff were grinning ear to ear. Mr. Chen was nodding with satisfaction, as if he'd known all along what would happen. That was beautiful, said a voice from the doorway. Professor Li stood there, coffee cup in hand. And that's exactly why you belong at the conservatory. He held up an envelope, not a thin rejection letter, but a thick packet of acceptance papers. This came to my office today, he said, holding it out to her. I thought you might want to open it here, surrounded by your other family. Min's hands shook as she took the envelope. The room held its breath as she read the first line. We are pleased to inform you. The cheers that followed were loud enough to rattle the windows. Mrs. Wang hugged her tight. The cook rang the order-up bell in celebration. Someone started a collection to buy sheet music for their piano. That afternoon, the diner's usual rhythm changed. Customers lingered longer over their coffee. The usually hurried lunch crowd took their time. Every so often, the sound of piano music would drift out from the storage room, sometimes classical, sometimes contemporary, sometimes Min's own compositions. Later, as she locked up for the night, Min paused by the piano. Her reflection in its polished surface showed someone different from the person she'd been that morning. Someone who was finally ready to step out of the shadows and into the spotlight of her own life. She played one more piece before leaving, soft and sweet in the empty diner. The music floated out through the crack under the door, down the quiet street, up into the star-speckled sky. A thank you note to the universe, written in melody. The practice rooms at the conservatory smelled of wood polish and possibility. Min spent every spare moment there, working around her diner shifts. Some nights, she'd arrive still wearing her work uniform, changing into concert clothes in the bathroom before her evening classes. Her first few weeks were a whirlwind of theory classes, practice sessions, and adjusting to being a student again. The other students were mostly younger, fresh-faced, and full of confidence. But what Min lacked in youth, she made up for in determination. She practiced during her lunch breaks at the diner's piano, late at night in her apartment, and every moment she could steal between serving customers. One rainy Tuesday, while rushing from work to her evening class, her phone buzzed. The hospital was calling about her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, who had no family nearby. She'd fallen and was asking for Min. Without hesitation, Min turned around, missing her important performance technique class to sit with her neighbor in the emergency room. The next day, Professor Li noticed her absence. I heard what happened, he said during his usual coffee time at the diner. Family emergencies are always valid reasons. Min wiped down his table, her shoulders tense. But the program requirements are important, he finished, but so is being human. Your music comes from your heart, from your experiences, from how you care for others. Don't lose that. The following weeks tested her in ways she hadn't expected. Mrs. Rodriguez needed help while recovering, and Min found herself juggling diner shifts, classes, practice sessions, and regular visits to her neighbor. Some nights, she practiced with her door open so Mrs. Rodriguez could hear the music from across the hall. The diner regulars stepped up in unexpected ways. Mr. Chen started bringing homemade soup for Mrs. Rodriguez. The morning coffee club took turns checking on her. Mrs. Wang adjusted Min's schedule to allow for both her classes and her caregiving duties. But the biggest challenge lay ahead. Her first public recital at the conservatory. It would count for 30% of her grade, and the thought of performing made her stomach churn. The memory of her last public performance, that disastrous graduation day, kept creeping back into her mind. One evening, while practicing at the diner's piano, her hands froze on the keys. The piece she'd chosen for the recital, Rachmaninoff's Prelude in G minor, suddenly felt impossible. She sat there, shoulders shaking, until she felt a gentle hand on her back. "You know what I think?" Mrs. Wang said, pulling up a chair. "I think you're playing the wrong piece." Min looked up, confused. "But it's a classic. Professor Lee said it would show my technical skills." Mrs. Wang shook her head. "Play the song you wrote. The one about the diner, about your life here. That's the story you need to tell." "But it's not." Min hesitated. "It's not traditional enough." "Neither are you," Mrs. Wang said simply. "And that's your strength." That night, Min stayed late at the diner, reworking her composition. She wove in new elements. The sound of rain on the windows, the rhythm of her footsteps rushing to check on Mrs. Rodriguez, the quiet moments of dawn which she practiced while her neighbors slept. The piece became more than just music. It became her story. When she finally played it for Professor Lee, his eyes widened. He paused, searching for words. "This is what we've been waiting to hear from you. This is real." The day before her recital, a notice appeared in the diner window. "Closed tomorrow evening. Supporting our pianist at her first concert." The regulars had already bought tickets. The kitchen staff had pressed their best clothes. Even Mrs. Rodriguez had convinced her doctor to let her attend. Min stood backstage, her heart pounding. Through a gap in the curtain, she could see her diner family filing into their seats, looking both out of place and perfectly right in the formal concert hall. They carried with them the strength she needed, the reminder that no matter what happened on stage, she had already succeeded in the most important ways. The concert hall lights dimmed, and a hush fell over the audience. Min stood in the wings, her black concert dress a far cry from her usual diner uniform. Through the curtain, she could hear the soft murmur of the crowd settling into their seats. Her hands were cold. They always got cold before playing. In the third row, Mrs. Wang sat with her arms crossed, looking as proud as any mother. Beside her, Mrs. Rodriguez beamed from her wheelchair, dressed in her Sunday best. The morning coffee club had taken up an entire row, and the kitchen staff clustered together near the back, still smelling faintly of French fries and coffee. Professor Lee caught her eye from the front row and gave a slight nod. In his hands was the program, where her piece was listed simply as Diner Symphony in D major. The title had made him smile when she'd submitted it, not quite traditional, but perfectly fitting. As she walked onto the stage, the spotlights felt warm on her face. The grand piano waited for her, its polished surface reflecting the stage lights like stars. This wasn't her grandmother's old upright or the digital piano in the diner's storage room. This was a concert piano, worthy of concert halls and professional musicians. She sat down, adjusted the bench, and placed her hands on the keys. In that moment of silence before the first note, she thought of everything that had led her here. The long nights practicing after double shifts, the endless cups of coffee that had fueled her studies, the support of her diner family, the memory of her grandmother. The first notes filled the hall, soft, like early morning light filtering through the diner's windows. Then came the melody she'd crafted from the sounds of her daily life. The rhythm of coffee cups clinking against saucers, the harmony of conversations overlapping during the lunch rush, the quiet moments before opening when the whole world seemed to hold its breath. As she played, she felt something shift inside her. The nervousness melted away, replaced by the pure joy of sharing her music. This wasn't just a performance. It was a thank you note to everyone who had believed in her, a love letter to the life she'd built, a celebration of second chances. In the middle section, where she'd woven in themes from her grandmother's favorite classical pieces, she heard a small gasp of recognition from Mrs. Rodriguez. The melodies soared and dipped, like the ups and downs of life itself, before returning to the familiar rhythms of the diner. When the final notes faded away, there was a moment of complete silence. Then the applause began, not the polite, measured applause of regular concertgoers, but the wholehearted cheering of people who had watched one of their own achieve something remarkable. Mr. Chen's voice called out, "Bravo!" from somewhere in the middle rows. Backstage, after the performance, Professor Lee handed her an envelope. Inside was an offer for a teaching position at the conservatory's community music program. Teaching piano to adult beginners, people who, like her, had put their dreams on hold. "We need teachers who understand that music doesn't always follow a straight path," he said. "Who know that it's never too late to start again." The celebration moved to the Golden Cup, where Mrs. Wong had prepared a feast. The diner's piano had been moved into the main dining room for the occasion. As Min played more casual pieces, jazz standards and pop songs, her conservatory classmates mixed with the regular customers, sharing stories and laughter. Looking around the room, Min realized something important. She hadn't just found her way back to music. She'd created something new, a harmony between her two worlds. The diner wasn't just a job anymore, and the conservatory wasn't just a dream. They were both part of who she was. Late that night, after everyone had gone home, Min sat at the diner's piano one more time. She played her grandmother's favorite nocturne, soft and sweet in the empty room. Outside, the city hummed its own melody, traffic and distant sirens, laughter and footsteps, the endless symphony of life moving forward. Tomorrow, she would be back in her uniform, serving coffee and taking orders. But now there would also be piano lessons to teach, music to compose, and more performances to give. The future stretched out before her like a familiar piece of music, the basic melody known, but with endless room for interpretation, for growth, for joy.